Relations that was conducted today. The first paper, paper 1, which was held in the morning shift. So without further ado, let's begin our discussion. The very first question. So section A, as you know very well, 5 questions, all have to be answered around 150 words. First one, explain the philosophical approach to the study of political theory. So in short, this question asks for a very basic and yet precise approach to, or rather, a precise account of what constitutes the philosophical approach to the study of political theory. It expects, of course, the coverage of its characteristics, strengths. So let's mention the characteristics. The strengths, and let's not forget, also very important, its relevance. We should mention this as well as a part of our answer. All these 3 aspects. So see, this topic or this philosophical approach, I would say, is the OG method in the political theory, Plato debating, Aristotle kind of stuff. And it's a favorite for setting the stage in any kind of PSIR paper. And UPSC loves these kind of foundational questions. So nothing unique when this question is asked. And if you look at the previous trends as well, this particular topic has appeared repeatedly, sometimes directly discuss the philosophical method, sometimes as normative approach, or sometimes in the context of comparing different methods, like say behavioral methods, empirical methods, etc. So that's why nothing exceptional when you see such a question. Now, what should a good answer have? So of course, you have to have a definition. Firstly, the definition, focusing on the normative part, speculative nature, engaging with ideals, engaging with values, justice, rights, values, justice, rights, etc. Then also mention some key thinkers, Plato, Aristotle, Rousseau, Rawls. Of course, bonus marks for referencing more thinkers. And also then major characteristics. That's very important, use of logic. So major characteristics like use of logic, use of ethics, prescriptive, what ought to be, not just what is. And see, the strength of this philosophical approach is that it lays the normative foundation. It inspires reform. So focus also on the strength aspect of this approach. So it lays, as I said, normative foundation. It also inspires reform. It gives depth to debates. Now, what can be a weakness? So that's why I said the weaknesses would be, it is sometimes also criticized for being too abstract, far removed from reality, right? So maybe more ivory tower, less ground report kind of stuff. So also we have to mention some weaknesses. Okay, like the pitfalls, turning into history of ideas, ignoring method. Okay, but what is a very important aspect here is that it tells us not just what is, but what ought to be and why. Okay, and then we can also have a line on contemporary relevance, that still shapes debates on justice, debates on equality, debates on democracy. The contemporary relevance, incorporate all these and it's done, right? So an ideal structure would be, in the introduction you simply define, or maybe a quote. In the body, mention the features, examples, strength, criticism, and then any contemporary use or example. That's it. So this would be your simple intro, body, conclusion format, where you mention all these aspects and conclude by maybe with a punchy statement like, say, in a world obsessed with data, the philosophical approach reminds us to ask, should we, instead of only can we, right? So that's it. Not at all a difficult question from any standard. Okay, let's move on to the next question, number B. So this one is write a note on the relation between equality and liberty from the multicultural perspective. So equality and liberty from a multicultural perspective. That's very interesting. See, this question wants an insightful note, I would say, on how equality and liberty, these two best friends who sometimes fight as well, how they relate to each other, and especially seen through the eyes of many cultures, not just that typical Western lens that we normally see. Okay. So this question focuses on the equality liberty relationship, which is, I think, I would say, an evergreen topic for UPSC, right? Part ideological theory, part practical politics. But the real aspect, or should I say the real tadka, the spice, is the multicultural perspective. That is the difference here. Testing whether you as an aspirant can go beyond the textbook liberalism and factor in the real world diversity. India, of course, right? So it is very relevant to debates on secularism, debates on minority rights, debates on group versus individuals. You see how and why these questions are put forward, right? See, uh, as far as previous year questions are concerned on this particular dimension or topic, if you look at it, of course, we have had variations on liberty versus equality, right? Multiculturalism's impact on core values. So these things have been asked multiple times, right? Now, earlier questions focused on conflicts, tensions. Recent ones want synthesis, how to make the two get along in diverse societies, especially like India. Okay, so what could you write in such a question or in this question? So start by, of course, defining equality, right? So we begin with a proper structured definition of equality, right? Equality would be getting the same treatment or opportunity, and then of course also liberty. So what would liberty be? Freedom to act, freedom to choose. And the classical liberal view would be liberty and equality sometimes clash because one person's freedom could restrict another person's equality and vice versa, right? And then you can explain through this multicultural lens in multicultural societies, group rights, so that is culture, language, religion, they are added, sometimes increasing both equality and liberty, right? Reservation, that is affirmative action for minorities, personal laws. So you can also, apart from, as I said, the example and the benefits, we also have some kind of criticism. We'll have to mention that as well. What can that be? See, multicultural policies can sometimes create new inequalities or curb some freedoms. Your right to follow traditions might limit my rights. Simple routine problems, right? So I would say the pitfall could be treating equality as sameness, missing the recognition factor that might be missing. Incorporate that. But again, sometimes we treat differently so that all can be free equally. You can mention some thinkers as also positive, negative liberty, Berlin, Kemleka, the group differentiated rights, Taylor, etc. Mention some, give Indian examples like Indian secularism, bilingualism in other countries, affirmative action debates, and that's perfect. Okay. See, as far as what could be a possible concern when you attempt such a question would be a risk of being too vague on the multicultural aspect, because you have to give very crisp examples, especially if possible India related, right? And avoiding a very generic kind of liberty versus equality debate. You have to zoom in on the multicultural perspective. Okay, so we should not oversimplify the complexity, because this is a complex issue. We have to treat it in the same complex fashion. So very simple structure in the introduction, quick definition, flag this multicultural angle. In the body, you talk about how multiculturalism reshapes the classic equality liberty debate, and then examples from India or other diverse countries. Maybe the concept of bilingualism, as I said, in a country like Canada, that could serve as a good example, right? And then challenge or critique to this, or criticism to this approach. That's it. Um, in conclusion, you can add things like multicultural societies can at best strive for equal respect and maximum freedom, even if some friction remains. That's it. Simple, sweet, nothing much to worry about. All that has been asked so far is covered largely in any kind of discussion on PSIR. Okay, next one. Explain Macpherson's view on power. See, as far as this question is concerned, it expects very simple, compact explanation of C.B. Macpherson's analysis of power, and I would say upgrade from the usual power means strength kind of logic to something critically more nuanced, right? Now, why was this question asked? Again, difficult to put in any current context, but see, Macpherson has been a major figure, especially in the modern political theory. His views bridge that liberal and Marxist thought without picking permanent sides. That's a good thing. The question also will nudge any aspirant here in this case to show they know not just the classic theorists, but also 20th century people or theorists who are game changers, right? See, again, in this entire PSIR situation, Macpherson has been a recurring character. Questions about democracy or liberalism has been asked, or interpretation of classical ideas, okay? Theory of positions, views on power. You will find them sprinkled here and there in paper 1 and 2, right? Now, what about the important pointers here? So, see, Macpherson has moved away from power over versus power to, that this binary, focusing more on, I would say, power as a social relationship. This shift has been witnessed. Okay. And he's also very famous for outlining this power as the capacity to do or enjoy something, and power as the capacity to prevent others from doing or enjoying something. So, distinction between the creative power, that is positive liberty, developing capabilities, self realization, and power as domination, negative liberty, holding others back. So, liberalism based on possessive individualism, right? Possessive individualism. That's it. So, this would turn power into control or market capacity. So, power as capacity for human development, not for human domination. Democracy should maximize developmental power of all, minimizing power over others. Okay. So that's it. And you can also add things like, democracy is justified when it grows people's power to become, not others' power over them, right? See, liberal societies have also been critiqued for glorifying this individual acquisition, this concept of possessive individualism, because as if it's like collecting stuff is the same as being free without the power of any kind of reconceptualization, right? You can also add in quotes like, in unequal societies, power becomes centralized, leading to domination, not empowerment, right? So I think, again, if you know the idea, you can express this clearly. What can be a concern? Maybe don't forget to mention how this view links to democracy, how this view links to equality, how this view links to democracy, how this view links to equality, how this view links to individual development, right? You need to have that link. Maybe something like freedom from domination. All these aspects need to be incorporated. That's it. Okay. Yes, time will be of importance, because fitting Macpherson's very dense theory into 150 words, right? that would be a challenge. Okay, so introduction, explain who Macpherson is, his focus on power as a social dynamic, then in the body, his dual concept of power, linking to possessive individualism, social inequality, and briefly why this uh, matters, especially for understanding real world democracy, right? And then you can summarize by this very basic question that Macpherson says or asks rather, that are we empowering people or are we just giving a few folks unlimited veto over everyone else? A very key concern. So that's it. Next one, let's move on. Mention the difference between Italian and German brands of fascism. So see, this is a very side-by-side spot the difference kind of question. Whether what sets Mussolini's Italian fascism apart from Hitler's German fascism. I mean, of course, as you know, they were not some poster boys for world peace, right? And their methods and ideologies have very unique twists. I'm sure they are not up for any kind of Nobel Peace Prize like our Trump is. But so this question, see, fascism is not something that can be one size fits all villain costume. No, you have to show the nuance, right? Because history is not like some black and white movie. And again, this is this typical favorite of UPSC, comparing political ideologies that shaped especially 20th century's, I would say, darkest chapters. So again, nothing out of the ordinary that would surprise an aspirant. See, variations of this particular theme have appeared, comparing fascism to Nazism, features of totalitarian regimes, uh, ideological roots. So they have been asked, okay, distinguish, compare, critically analyze. So again, it's mere change or modification of words, nothing beyond that. So here, Italian fascism, Mussolini, rooted in nationalism, rooted in authoritarianism, right? Revival of the Roman glory. Okay, not that race, but the state was supreme. So here the focus is on state being supreme. So lesser obsession, I would say, with racial purity, more about suppressing dissent, unifying Italy under a corporatist regime. So maybe not so much of focus on this racial purity part. As far as German Nazism or fascism is concerned, it has turned fascism into a full-blown, I would say, a race theory. Okay. So here we'll, I think, this very simple idea how they're obsessed with this Aryan supremacy, anti-Semitism, creating a master race of sorts. So state ideology was driven by racist doctrine, aggressive expansionism, right? So you're expanding consistently. So the entire concept was racist doctrine. So Italian fascism is more about a strong state, less about genocidal madness. German fascism is about racial policies, genocide, extreme anti-Semitism, totalitarian control. Okay. I would say Mussolini would rather be seen as wanting everyone to march in step, but Hitler wanted everyone marching, but all with only pure Aryan blood, as you can put it. So that's it, simple, straightforward. I think there should not be any concern. The only concern can be a sense of oversimplification that both are bad regimes without spelling very clearly as to how and why, right? Missing the distinct racial dimension in German fascism, that could be a challenge. And also use of methods. Let's not forget, you have to add the use of methods like, say, propaganda, cult of personality, suppression, but the how and why matter, right? See, both use propaganda, both use cult of personality, both use suppression. How? Why? Important. So focus on those as well. So in the introduction, talk about a brief definition of fascism, mention main countries and main leaders. So When you write the definition there itself, please mention the countries also and the leaders as well. Then you can either have a table or bullet points on differences, ideology, race, methods, goals, whatever, and then maybe examples or events, right? Nuremberg laws, the Lateran Treaty in Italy, all these things. And then towards the end, summarize why Hitler's fascism became a synonym for ultimate evil. Mussolini is more remembered for all show, less horror version, I would say, right? So that is why one of the most popular characters in cinema who is being repeated multiple movies made on this idea and on this person is Hitler. Easy to show evil, right? Anyway, so that was it. Now the last question in this 10 marker. Explain briefly the elite theory of democracy. So elite theory of democracy. See, this question asks for a very concise explanation of the elite theory, a major classical and contemporary lens to understand how democracies actually function. I mean, of course, not as perfect people's rule, but as ruled by few influential people. Okay. See, elite theory remains a staple in explaining the contradictions between democratic ideals and political realities. You have to understand this very important point for others and people who do not have a PSR optional. This is very important. This will help you understand that on one hand, you have these democratic ideals, and on the other hand, you have the very core concept of, I would say, political realities. Why are they so different? The answer is somewhat here. Okay. See, I would not say something very unique, because UPSC loves to test theories of democracy, elite theory, pluralism, participative democracy. They are favorites, right? And in governance and political sociology aspect, they have appeared in different forms. So nothing unique here. Okay. So as far as pointers are concerned, mentioned how it was developed by thinkers like Mosca, Pareto, Wright Mills, and the basic premise that in any society, power is concentrated in the hand of a small elite group, regardless of the a formal democratic framework that exists. So, small elite group. What features then? Features elite control of all the key institutions. They make crucial decisions. Masses are mainly passive in nature, so they are seen as cynical, but offer, of course, practical explanation of political power concentration. Right? See, it has very strong contemporary relevance also. How power concentration works in party politics, in business, in bureaucracy. Okay, think something like corporate lobbying. Think of all these think tanks. And let's not go too far. Why can't we just think of dynastic politics, right? Which we witness on a regular basis. So, yes, pretty simple. You have to balance theory with some contemporary illustrations as well. And yes, please, in such questions, please don't, I think you should rather resist yourself from this temptation of making it a political rant. No, no frustration on the paper. Be very genuine and limit yourself to explaining everything, right? So introduction, define, mention some key theorists in the body, main features of this theory and some criticism. And in conclusion, why it still matters. Maybe that's democracy's hidden reality. Okay. Now let's move on to the next questions. Question 2, the 3 parts. The first question, A, what is the Marxist and liberal approach towards the state? On what grounds are the theoretical differences between them premised? Explain. So see, uh, this question expects a very detailed explanation and, of course, a comparison of the Marxist as well as a liberal approach towards the state. Now, see, the focus has to be on the, or rather, the emphasis should be what are the grounds of their fundamental theoretical perspective. Just a minute, guys. Okay, sorry for the small minor disturbance. So, as I said, so the question is, what is the Marxist and liberal approach towards the state, and on what grounds are the theoretical differences between them premised? Explain. See, the Marxist and the liberal perspectives represent two opposing worldviews on politics and on power, which is very actually crucial for understanding political debates, not just in our country, but globally. And Marxist versus liberal state theories have appeared multiple times in various formats, comparison, critique, theoretical differences, etc., in the paper. Nothing unique at all. So, if it comes to writing a very good answer, I would say, so liberal approach sees the state as neutral arbiter, ensuring individual rights, freedoms, law and order. It is rooted in the social contract theory. Locke, Rousseau mentioned those names. State protects private property, enforces contracts, mediates conflicts, emphasizes pluralism, separation of powers, democratic participation. So mention all these pointers, right? A state is legitimate because it is consented to by citizens. Now, coming to the Marxist approach, it views the state as an instrument of class domination, primarily protecting the interest of the ruling capitalist class, the bourgeois. It originates from the conflict theory and historical materialism. Marx, Engels mention those names. It sees state functions as what? Perpetuating nothing but capitalism, suppressing the working class, the proletariat. So it envisions, I would say, the eventual withering away of the state after the revolution of the proletariat. So the theoretical difference, ontology of how liberals see competing interests balanced by the state. Marxists see fundamental class conflict and the role of state when it comes to, say, liberalism. We have the more neutral empire. When it comes to Marxist approach, we see the role of state as a tool of suppression. And then one is reformist, more democratic in nature. The other would be seen as revolutionary, radical. So, along these lines mentioned, then contemporary relevance, as I said, liberal notions underpin most modern democracies. Marxist critiques inform debates on inequality, state bias, social justice, etc. See, so again, as I said, simple, easy, straightforward, right? You can just write about the introduction, defining the two approaches briefly. In the body, explain the liberal approach, explain the Marxist approach, and point out the core theoretical differences. Okay. Next question. Karl Popper. So Karl Popper presents a defense of the open society against its enemies. Elaborate. Okay. So Karl Popper, see again, as I said, this question would require a very elaborate uh, approach or elaboration on Popper's argument defending liberal, democratic, and open societies against totalitarian threats and dogmatic ideologies. Okay, see, Popper's concept of open society, as far as this is concerned, is a very key aspect for understanding, the ideological battles between democracy, between authoritarianism, and this is especially relevant in not just uh, India, but in today's world of rising populism and illiberalism, I would say. Okay, so again, for a pretty decent answer, definition of open society, let's not forget to define this: a society based on democratic governance, rule of law, individual freedoms, continual critical scrutiny of political power, and then Popper's critique of closed societies. So, also, as far as the closed societies are concerned, what are the concerns, how they are characterized by rigid dogmas, tribalism, totalitarian control. Now, what could be the enemies of open society? Historicism, belief in the inevitable historical loss, totalitarian ideologies, fascism, communism, intolerance, political repression. And then we can also present some defense strategies, like, say, promoting critical thinking, transparency, freedom of speech, checks on institutions. So the mm, emphasis is on the piecemeal social engineering, incremental reforms, gradual reforms. Don't have the utopian grand designs. Okay, and you can mention that very famous line, the tolerance paradox: unlimited tolerance must lead to the disappearance of tolerance. Okay, and then some contemporary relevance, how we have seen pushback against authoritarianism and populism globally. Okay, so that's it. We have to make sure that you juggle philosophy and the practical governance in a very concise form. Okay, avoid getting lost in this very dense academic jargon. Keep on giving contemporary examples, very very important. Focus on that as well. So in the introduction, defining open society, mention Popper's context, then enemies and threats to open society, Popper's defense, and then why it is important in today's global age, today's especially existing global political challenges. Okay. Next, explain how Rawls used the liberal and egalitarian perspective to develop his concept of distributive justice. Okay. So, see this question, simple explanation on John Rawls combined liberalism's emphasis on individual rights with egalitarianism's focus on equality. And that's how you formulate his very influential theory of what distributive justice. So again, John Rawls is a very, I would say, a heavyweight in modern political philosophy, especially on the idea of justice, the theory of justice. So nothing unique when such questions are asked. John Rawls' theory is a consistently occurring theme on questions, especially with relation to social justice, equality, political philosophy, etc. Of course, let's not forget the welfare state models, and it is often intertwined, especially over debates with debates over affirmative action, welfare, rights, etc. So, talk about how Rawls uses the liberalism's emphasis on individual freedom, rights as a foundation. The justice system must not trample individual liberties. It also incorporates the concept of egalitarianism by insisting on fairness, improving the position of the worst off through the difference principle. Again, experts would know this. Difference principle: inequalities are allowed only if they benefit what? The least advantaged. And then introducing the original position, the veil of ignorance, as those hypothetical devices for fair choice of principles. No one knows their social status, so decisions are unbiased. Okay. It balances equal liberty. Everyone has the same rights with social equality, addressing economic inequalities. So the theories that you see both respect freedom and demand social justice. So bridging that liberal and egalitarian ideas, okay, and how they have influenced policies on welfare, affirmative action, human rights, etc. globally. That's it. So I don't see this as a challenge in any form or manner for anyone. You know all these things, be it something as abstract as a veil of ignorance, etc. It's all taught. So you would very well be able to answer this particular question, starting with briefly the idea of Rawls as a thinker, combining liberalism and egalitarianism, then explaining the liberal elements, individual rights and liberties, difference principle, social fairness, original position, veil of ignorance, all these things need to be incorporated. Now, coming to the third one. So, provide a comparative analysis of behavioral and institutional approach to the study of political theory. So see here, this question demands a very detailed analysis, or other, I would say, a comparison of two major approaches to political theory: the behavioral approach as well as the. So this approach focuses on the empirical study of political behavior, and the institutional approach, which just a minute, guys. So the institutional approach, the concentration is on the formal structures, the constitutions of political systems. Okay. So this question, I would say, this is actually it's a litmus test for aspirants' understanding of shifts in political science methodology, and from the classical focus on formal institutions to modern emphasis on individuals and group behavior. Okay. So what would you write here? Of course, as far as the institutional approach is concerned, talk about how the focus is on political institutions, like, say, the LEJ, right, the legal framework, assuming that these structures largely determine the political outcomes. They have dominated the classical political science and legalistic political philosophy, Aristotle, Machiavelli, all these people. And you can criticize as well. Some criticism would be they're too rigid. It overlooks actual political behavior, attitudes, culture. Then we have the behavioral approach, which has emerged post the Second World War, influenced by social sciences. The focus is on empirical observation, voter behavior, public opinion, political participation. So this seeks to be more value neutral, more scientific, more generalizable through data. And of course, it may neglect the normative values, may neglect political ideas. It also, risks this reductionism. This also could be a concern for the behavioral approach. Okay. So then mention those comparative pointers on how the focus, structure versus behavior, methodology, normative versus empirical, the scope, formal institutions versus citizens' actions. So they are complementary, I would say, rather than oppositional in advanced political sciences. So that's it. Start by writing in your introduction about a definition of both the approaches. In the body, mention the characteristics of institutional and behavioral approaches, then comparison, differences, then complementarities, etc. And finally, in the conclusion, highlight their relevance in understanding politics comprehensively. Okay. So far, pretty straightforward as questions. 3B now, state does the greatest harm to mankind by destroying individuality, which lies at the root of all progress. Gandhiji, elucidate. So, see, this question again requires us to explain Gandhiji's paradoxical statement that while the state represents progress, it also harms humanity by suppressing individuality, the very seed of progress. So Gandhiji's critique of modern political institutions is vital for understanding Indian political thought, alternative visions of governance. And again, as I said, such kind of philosophical critique of state power, liberty versus authority, Indian thinkers' insight, they are frequently asked. Okay, the tension between collective progress, individual freedom, it is a recurrent theme. So here you can talk about Gandhiji's idea of state as an instrument of power and control, which is so the state would be an instrument of power, an instrument of control, which is necessary for order and progress. Now, the state centralizes power, it also standardizes what life, yes, it it suppresses individual creativity, conscience, freedom, and this suppression is what leads to destruction of individuality, which Gandhiji considered harmful to human civilization and of course to progress. You can then contrast this with Gandhiji's advocacy of self-rule, Swaraj, village autonomy, where individual moral freedom thrives. The paradox is this only: while state brings structural order, it also threatens personal liberty, and it also threatens ethical growth of any kind, right? So its relevance today, debates on bureaucratic overreach, minimum bureaucracy, or minimum government, maximum governance kind of idea that we want to push forward, overreach, surveillance, etc., loss of personal freedoms. So we can have a lot of relevance here today with respect to structure versus violation of individuality. Okay, simple, straightforward. We'll have to focus on some kind of current analogy, some kind of examples where you witness how enhanced structure, something as simple as service delivery through e-governance requires lot of personal data, right? So something as simple as this to complicated concepts on bureaucratic overreach and surveillance can be mentioned. They all will be a part of this very simple idea, right? So that's it. That's how you would attempt this particular question. Moving on to the last question in question 3. Explain how the slogan, "The personal is political," addresses the issue of women's oppression and discrimination. See, this entire concept requires you to explain how this feminist slogan, "The personal is political," highlights the connection between private experiences of women and the broader political structures of oppression. So, in fact, this slogan is the cornerstone of political feminist political theory and activism. Right? It is very crucial in understanding the gendered nature of power and society. Feminism, gender issues, debates on oppression, they appear frequently in PSIR papers. So nothing to again worry. So explain the slogan. Then personal experiences of discrimination, violence, domestic roles, they are not isolated incidents, but they reflect the systemic inequalities. Very important to draw this parallel here. And it highlights that issues like domestic violence, reproductive rights, unpaid labor, they're all political matters requiring political solutions. Okay. It also emphasizes the critique of patriarchy embedded in private spheres, families, setup, marriage, culture, and also shows how feminist movements politicized private issues. challenging this very, I would say, public policy. And law, of course, it shows how the feminist movements politicize private issues. It shows how these feminist movements have questioned and raised concerns on policies made by our politicians, right? It has also uh, raised concerns on the structure itself of laws, what goes on behind the law, the core essential idea of the law. Okay. And again, we'll have to also discuss on how this bridges a traditional political domain, state legislature, and social domain, home relationships. Okay. Examples like campaigns against domestic violence laws, workplace sexual harassments, recognition of unpaid housework, something that you call care economy, right? All these need to be incorporated. Okay. So I think one major concern here could be you have to be very clear on the personal experience connect with the political structure, and also avoiding, I would say, neglecting examples. So please mention examples, etc. So defining the slogan in the introduction, its importance in the body links some personal experience to political oppression, role of patriarchy and the private sphere, and feminist politicization of these personal issues. Give some examples. That's it, right? End of story. So this is all. Now coming to question number 4. Fourth one. The foundational base of Western democracy has been shaped by Locke's ideas of constitutionalism, freedom, and property. Elucidate. Impact of John Locke's political ideas primarily constitutionalism, liberty, property rights on the formation and development of Western democratic traditions. See, Locke is considered the father of liberal democracy, right? Um, I would say a very core influence on Western political philosophy and institutions. And such questions, or rather precise questions, very close variants, Locke's liberalism, a social contract, they have been asked multiple times. Okay. So here, talk about the idea of constitutionalism. Locke advocated for the rule of law, limiting arbitrary power through what? Through constitution, which would balance authority and individual rights. The idea of freedom, he emphasized natural rights, life, liberty, property, arguing that the state must protect these freedoms. Then, of course, property. His labor theory of property is this only, right? Arguing that individuals own what they produce, making property rights central to the idea of liberty. Yes. So Locke's ideas provided the intellectual, I would say, the backbone to the glorious revolution, 1680, 1688, and later also inspired the American Declaration of Independence, the French Declaration of Rights. So his vision has been, his vision of government, consent of the governed. Yes or no? Government is what? Government with the consent of governed. Separation of powers, right to revolution. These have shaped modern representative democracies. The emphasis on civil liberties, the emphasis on private property rights, the emphasis on limited government, they remain core concepts, they remain core values to the Western democratic ideals or values, right? So pretty simple in this context as well. You just have to elaborate, right? I would just say that just focus not only on this entire historical narration, but connecting ideas to democratic principles also. I think that's the only way to make a mistake here, by limiting yourself to this, over historical narration in your question. Okay. And that's it. I think clear attribution, if given to Locke's influence to specific democratic developments, would be perfectly fine. Mentioning all these three aspects constitutionalism as a limitation of state power, liberty as a natural right, property right as a pillar of individual freedom, and that's it, done. Oh, okay, next question. Hannah Arendt analyzed a few categories of vita activa. Explain. See, Hannah's entire conceptual categories of the vita activa, which uh, describes different modes of human activity in political and social life, is what you need to explain here. Okay, so Arendt's distinction between types of human activity is quite pivotal if you look at it in political theory, especially concerning public life, work, labor, etc. Okay, and questions on her political thought, questions on view on action, labor, public realm, they have been asked again and again. Okay, so one such I mean, how you would begin this answer, of course, define, right? Active life, vita activa, that's Latin for active life only, right? Contrasting with we had the contemplative life, vita contemplativa. Contemplativa, yes. So vita activa versus vita contemplativa, active life versus contemplative life. Mention with that, open your answer with that only, defining that. And then the three categories of vita activa. What are those three categories? Labor, yes, number one. Then number two is work. And number three is what? Action. These three categories: labor, necessary for biological survival; repetitive, renews life; food, production; work, creates or other creation of durable things, building the human environment; art, tools, institutions; action, the highest form of activity involving speech, involving interactions in public realm. So that enables freedom, that enables freedom in politics as well. Okay, so then you have to also emphasize that for Arendt, action is distinctively political and related to freedom. So these categories reveal the structure of human activities, their political significance. Okay, see, as far as contemporary relevance is concerned, we can also understand political engagement beyond mere survival and production. Okay, so I think no concerns here. We just have to avoid any kind of confusion between these three categories. That's a basic idea. And you have to remain concise, as we say, remain concise yet comprehensive, especially in such questions. So introduce by defining the term, explain and differentiate the three categories, highlight the political importance of action. That's it, done. Last question under the first section. Do you think that legitimacy acquired by consent or manufactured by indoctrination is an essential element in the maintenance of political rule? Justify with examples. So, this question simply asks whether political legitimacy, the foundation of rulers' right to govern, must come from genuine consent of the governed, or whether it can be created, whether it can be manufactured through indoctrination, through propaganda, through coercion, through manipulation. That's the idea. See, legitimacy is central to political stability. Legitimacy is central to authority. And that's a very basic, a very core theme in political theory, a core theme in governance. Okay. And again, this entire concept of legitimacy, authority, consent, political obedience, they appear frequently. So how do we address it? Firstly, legitimacy by consent. Classical and modern democracies, or rather the theories of democracy, they emphasize that political rule is legitimate if accepted freely by citizens. The social contract idea, elections, rule of law. So that would foster what? That would foster something like, say, stability. That would foster something like participation. That would foster something like accountability. Okay. You can also then talk about legitimacy by indoctrination, how authoritarian regimes often cultivate legitimacy via propaganda, via propaganda, via censorship, via control over flow of information, right? So manufacturing consent to sustain power. So there is no real approval. All consent is manufactured. That is missing. Okay. Examples how democratic India's legitimacy rests on electoral consent, on constitutionalism, maybe North Korea's regime. It relies on indoctrination, it relies on fear rather than free consent. That's it. In the conclusion, you can talk about how, while consent based legitimacy, of course, is ideal and sustainable, indoctrination can, uh, I think, at least for a temporary period, maintain rule. But yes, it risks instability. So mention that as well. It risks instability, resistance, and ethical concerns. So yes, indoctrination can, of course, for a temporary period, help you in maintaining rule, right? Okay. That's it. Again, as I say, see nothing as a concern or a problem, just finding the balance, defining the terms, discussing both these things, having some examples, and that's it. And maybe in the conclusion also assess which form is more important, right? Because that is what you have to explain. Let's move on now to the next section with the 5 questions. First one, explain briefly the role of peasant movements after 1857 and before independence. So again, I would not worry on these questions much. Nothing. What do I tell you? You know almost everything here, right? The focused overview of peasant movements post 1857 rebellion till, of course, 1947. So that's there, right? Socio-political role in this entire anti-colonial struggle needs to be highlighted. Okay, so what do you mention here? The context, firstly, peasants have suffered from the exploitative colonial revenue system, zamindari oppression, forced cultivation, inflation. Then talk about the major movements like the Deccan riots of 1875. Deccan riots 1875. Then the Mopla rebellion, though again I would personally have a serious concern calling it a rebellion, but what can we say? That's a history we are being taught, right? So I would again resist the temptation to call it a genocide, but still, sadly, when things change for the better, when the political class views us fit to know real history, then maybe we'll hope one day that our bureaucrats will choose to define this with a better word. But till then, what do we do? We have to also clear the exam, right? Then the Kheda Satyagraha, Bardoli, Champaran movements, etc. Mention all these things, right? Also, the political role, early stages, they're localized, they were spontaneous. So, those stages, localized, spontaneous. We have then moved on, shifted to this integration with the nationalist politics, expanding Congress support base also. It has pressured the colonial governments for rent reduction, tenancy reforms, legal protections, right? See, caste and class challenge has been there, which has limited the unified mass action. So, local elites, local intermediaries, those have played roles. In fact, Bipin Chandra's quote that how Bipin Chandra has emphasized peasantry as the national movement's foundation. Okay. So that's it, pretty simple. I mean, this is nothing that you need to explain or I need to explain to all the points, in fact, more than me, I'm sure. So write a note on Dalit perspective of Indian national movement. Second question. So here the question simply expects us to have a concise summary of Dalit community's outlook, their role, their experiences within the Indian national movement, right? highlighting the inclusivity aspect, highlighting the conflicts with the freedom struggle, examining how marginalized groups like Dalits have engaged or resisted the mainstream nationalist politics. Okay, so see, Dalit participation was complex, simultaneously a part of national movement and often alienated by the caste hierarchy entrenched in the mainstream leadership, right? Prominent Dalit leaders like Dr. Ambedkar, they have emphasized the need for separate political safeguards, social reforms. They have challenged Hindu caste oppressions, right? In fact, I hope you remember the Pune Pact. So Ambedkar's critique of Gandhiji's approach, the focus on separate electorate issue, the focus on caste reforms, and see, Dalit movements have pushed for the abolition of untouchability, access to education, political representation. Again, there could be a concern here. If you read Dharmpalji's Tree of Life, you will find that the educational segregation, or rather the you know denial of education to Dalits, is not as much as is presented by the Britishers, later on adopted by our modern historians in India. But still, again, as I said, till we are reading those books and till UPSC expects us to write those answers, these words have to be mentioned in your answer. There is no point in getting upset and angry about these aspects. That's the harsh reality. So that's there. So I mean, see that this struggle has also broadened the national movement social agenda way beyond mere anti-colonialism towards, I would say, social justice. The Pune Pact, as I said, it has marked a compromise, uh, less than what Ambedkar wanted, but crucial for Dalit political representation. And you can also just summarize by mentioning on the contemporary relevance, how Dalit assertion has influenced the post-independent affirmative action, right? Especially with respect to in politics as well as in uh, public employment, educational, interference or affirmative actions came post, Supreme Court judgment and through an amendment, but still that was there. So again, simple, straightforward, nothing much to worry about. You have to mention, not to forget the key events, the key figures. The conclusion has to also relate to some kind of legacy which reflects even today. That would summarize the answer. Next, land reforms programs led to some constitutional amendments. Comment. So, concise explanation of how land reform initiatives in India necessitated a constitutional amendments to support their legal and administrative implementation. See, land reforms were critical to post-independence socio-economic restructuring affecting agrarian relations, redistribution of land, rural empowerment, all these things. So, what do you mention? Land reforms were aimed at abolishing zamindari system, tenancy reform, sealing on the land holdings for equitable distribution. Now, to implement these reforms, certain amendments were necessary, right? Sometimes those would override the fundamental rights to property also, including, say, Article 19(1)(f) or Article 31, right? So we know very well the very first Amendment Act that was made in this regard, the 17th one, the 25th one, they have all strengthened state's power over property for social welfare. I hope you remember that state can make any law in pursuance of two DPSPs, 39B and C, which may also violate Articles 14 and 19, but will not be challenged on the grounds of violation of 14-19. What is that? That's the exact same idea, strengthening the state's power for social welfare. So these amendments have balanced. These amendments have, as I said, ensured harmony or balanced individual property rights with social justice goals, right? See, land reforms remain an unfinished agenda, right? But constitutional changes, they have provided legal backing for agrarian justice. Okay. That's it. Linking land reforms with specific amendments clearly, avoiding any kind of vague generalities. That's it. You are good to go with this question. Nothing different, difficult in this particular question. Uh, let's move on to the next one, 5D. Delineate the key factors that have shaped the evolving political landscape in J&K post 2019. So here the question expects us to have a very concise, as I say, concise yet comprehensive overview of the major political, legal, social, and security factors influencing J&K's changing landscape. And we know this reason for this question, of course, the recent concerns, demand for statehood, the Pahalgam attack on a religious group, all these things have shaped the need for this question, right? We don't see this as something that could not be asked. This was very well on the cards. Okay. Now, see, you have to mention the key legal political changes. August 5th issue, how the powers of 370 were abrogated, how it was bifurcated into two UTs and all, how the special status was ended, or rather the temporary status was removed, how all the state central laws were fully applied, increased militarization, communication blackouts, clampdowns initially. Later on, we still face ongoing challenges from terrorism, cross-border issues, mentioning examples, right? Then political developments could be as shrinking of regional parties' influence, rise of pro-India sentiment versus alienation among some locals, delayed assembly elections that created a sense of democratic deficit, but with Supreme Court's interference, elections were conducted. Demands for statehood, but Supreme Court had itself raised concerns that amidst the rising threat to life and Pahalgam attack, we need to wait maybe. In fact, this case is pending in the Supreme Court, where petitioners are expecting a restoration of statehood demand, but Supreme Court has given center 2 months to respond on this. Okay. Then economic and social factors. So, as I said, you have to talk about the legal aspect, mention the security aspect, mention the political developments also, that's also there. Then economic and social factors, let's not forget that. Let's add that as well. Economic and social factors. Okay. Apart from it, human rights. Apart from, I mean, human rights and civil liberties would be the same thing. Then regional and international reactions. How has this been perceived? So under economic and social factors, we'll focus on the developmental projects, investments, integration into national mainstream, concerns over demographic changes, citizenship rights. Then some allegations of human rights violation have been there. Initially, restriction on the freedom of speech and expression, Supreme Court's intervention. Then, as far as reaction has been concerned, we have seen some diplomatic tension with our best friend Pakistan. Certain narrative building at international forums, it has now died down largely. Okay. So yes, the only thing would be, please ensure multifaceted approach all the events and avoid any kind of biased or partisan tone. Maintain analytical neutrality. In such questions, people tend to become biased. So please don't be partisan. Avoid it at any costs. Have a very neutral analytical tone with respect to various categories. That's it. Okay. It's a very simple, straightforward question. Next one. How far has the NHRC succeeded in achieving its objective? Comment. So see, again, NHRC, as far as this body is concerned, write about the objectives of NHRC: investigating human rights violations, recommending remedial measures, promoting awareness, advising government policy. As we say, the advisor, the protector, etc. of human rights. Okay. monitor of human rights. So success factors like increased visibility of human rights issues, timely interventions in high profile cases, uh, custodial deaths, for example, violence against minorities, public awareness campaigns involving roping in NGOs, visiting jails frequently to look into the condition of inmates, all these things, and give examples of success. Challenges, so limited enforcement power. Of course, these are just a body which can give recommendations. There are delays in investigations, pendency of cases or other complaints here. They depend on police for investigation, which itself is running short of staff, and then most complaints are against police only. Then political and administrative pressures also, resource constraint, staff constraint, limited reach in rural or remote areas. Recent NHRC reports can be looked into. You can quote those reports, mention them as well. It's all covered. In fact, such questions are covered in governance as well in paper 2. So any non-PSIR optional student can also attempt this question beautifully. So condense all this in 150 words. Again, very simple, nothing at all unique, right? So that's it. Now let's move on to the next question. Parliamentary committees are indispensable to the legislative process. So again, a very important aspect of our entire concept or functioning of parliament is the parliamentary committees, right? So they are in fact fundamental to, as people say, Indian legislative functioning. And they ensure detailed scrutiny, bipartisan cooperation, efficient lawmaking, etc. So here, function of committees, types of committees, how we say cross pollination. Committees have members from both Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha, joint committees, right? Of course, not all committees are joint, but the joint ones, the important ones, are joint largely. They foster dialogue, they foster consensus across chambers. So mention the advantages like specialized expertise, detailed discussions, reduced conflicts, reduced delays, enhancing transparency, enhancing accountability, keeping a check on the government. It also facilitates bipartisan cooperation, strengthening the quality of bills, proposals, etc. PAC, estimates committee, keep a check on the expenditure by the government, giving government directions on how to spend money, avoid wasteful expenditure, all these things, right? And then limitations on how the function recommendations are advisory in nature. They are running short of time. Governments don't take the recommendations sincerely. Bills are not sent to or referred to parliamentary committees regularly, right? That's it. Simple, straightforward, nothing much to discuss here. Moving on to the next one. Examine the constitutional provisions and the nature of advisory jurisdiction of Supreme Court of India. Evaluate with examples. I hope you know why this question has been asked. Because Supreme Court has been asked to answer certain questions under which article? 143 of 5-judge bench, advisory jurisdiction. So the UPSC had to ask question on this. They could not control their emotions at all. So yes, mentioning the constitutional provision, mentioning the entire structure of who can seek advice, what is the parameter, when can Supreme Court refuse to give advice, when does Supreme Court have to give advice, etc. Then the nature of advice, opinions are non-binding on government but binding on the other courts. Think of it as consultative jurisdiction. It is different from appellate or the original type of jurisdiction. What is the purpose? To examine, or rather to I'd say clarify complex legal, complex constitutional issues for the executive, for the legislature. Okay, so reference to the validity of elections of the president, reference to the Berubari case, reference to the 2G, the coal block allocation or 2G case, right? A reference to the recent case of a 2-judge bench over governor's authority in with respect to certain bills. Those are examples, right? That's it. So you can also mention some criticism. Sometimes it is seen as blurring the lines between the judiciary and the executive, possibly a risk of politicization. That's it. So again, a highly factual question, pretty straightforward. Then, the recent developments in Indian politics has not eroded the true spirit of federalism in India. Critically examine this statement with the help of appropriate examples. Of course, the recent political trends in our country have uh, they have rather been alleged to diminish or at least create some concerns over the federal structure or the spirit of federalism, but they have not eroded the underlying spirit of federalism. So yes, you can mention those aspects which have supported erosion, like say use of President's Rule 356, governor's power, central government's increased role in policy formulation, GST rollout, centralized taxation, delays in the restoring of state governments, say Jammu and Kashmir, then delays in the allocation of funds, etc. These are there. Increasing interference of governors with respect to passage of bills, but then safeguards remain intact. You can mention SR Bommai judgment, you can mention various committee recommendations, Sarkaria Commission, etc. You can mention how Supreme Court's interference on governors' power, keeping them in check, has been there. You know how fiscal federalism mechanisms like Finance Commission or the GST Council is a very good example. How they promote something called cooperative federalism. Okay, and then the multiplicity of very strong regional parties. They assert state interest, right? State governments continue the functioning with legislative and administrative powers. Okay, that's it. Mention these aspects with examples of how ongoing tussles have been there over, say, governor's role, agricultural laws, Supreme Court judgments, etc. Then the seventh question: enunciate the impediments to women's participation in local governance in the process of political decentralization. So, see, very clearly, or rather, expects a clear enumeration of the barriers that prevent or limit women's active involvement in grassroots political process, local self-government institutions, right? Okay. So you can simply mention on what are the issues like socio-cultural, what are all those impediments, socio-cultural barriers, what else, economic constraints, political fact. Economic constraints would mean what? Lack of financial independence, resource access, assets to contest elections, right? Under socio-cultural barriers, you can mention patriarchal norms, gender stereotypes, societal attitude confining women to domestic roles. Then you have, so as I said, socio-cultural barriers. Then you have some economic constraint also. Then you have some, let's not forget the political factors, dominance of male relatives, the proxy candidate, panchayat pati, intimidation, internal party dynamics. Then the educational awareness gaps that are there, low literacy levels, lack of political awareness, lack of assertiveness. Then the institutional challenges also. What are those institutional challenges? Lack of inadequate, or I would say inadequate training. Lack of training would be a very wrong word to make. Inadequate training, inadequate support, inadequate responsive mechanism. Then the safety issues, that's also there. Safety issues would be physical security, constrained mobility in rural settings. Then intersectional factors like, say, caste, class, and community dynamics, they also further marginalize women. Okay, and we have seen a lot of data, Niti Aayog data, NCRB data, which shows all this, which proves all this. So challenges faced, and then mention some suggestions on how to remove these challenges. Some issues like the proxy candidate, they can be removed with what steps. Other challenges can be removed with what kind of steps. That's it. Done. Simple. Next question. Caste remains a vital axis for political mobilization in India. How would the caste census address the aspirations of people? See, this question asks for the examination of role of caste in Indian politics, and also how conducting a caste-based census could help understand and fulfill the aspirations of various groups. Okay, see, caste continues to be a central factor in Indian electoral politics, in Indian social identity, in policy making. So, and in fact, the renewed interest recently with respect to the focus on caste census has made this topic more important, very, very topical, timely, right? Especially with the caste census being conducted in Bihar as well. And now the center's steps also, or acceptance, acknowledgement of caste census across the country. So caste as a political axis can be mentioned very clearly. You can mention that as well. A caste as a political axis, electoral politics heavily, how it relies or is also influenced by caste alliances. It's influenced by vote bank mobilization, social identity politics. They shape party strategies, candidate selection, all these things. And then, of course, let's not forget the role of caste census. That's also there. The role of caste census. It will provide an updated and maybe a comprehensive data, right? Data on caste demographics. So that could enable us to have more targeted policies. It will help us. So one thing would be targeted policies. Then resource allocation would also enhance, improve drastically. That's there. Reservation policies can be made better, welfare schemes can be more equitable in nature. It will also empower the marginalized castes by recognizing their population, recognizing their issues officially. And it also facilitates policy formulation, addressing things like caste-based disparities, and they will also ensure better representation, right? Now come the challenges. So what can be the challenge could be the political misuse, manipulation of data, fear of increased caste divisions. We are already deeply entrenched. You want to further entrench the already existing cleavages. That's of course a concern, right? And then what about the privacy concerns, identity concerns? Okay, so that's it. Give examples of Bihar, Tamil Nadu, etc. National debates on OBC, SC/ST reservation limits and all. Mention all these things. That's it. Okay. Now, seventh question, third part. There is a debate on the procedure for appointment of CEC and ECs to Election Commission of India and lies its various aspects. Simple, straightforward. Mention all the constitutional provisions. Mention the Anup Barnwal judgment, Supreme Court's interference here. Mention also how in other important positions we do find Supreme Court's uh, involvement. And then you can have a correlated example of how even we have a pending case in the Supreme Court with respect to CAG's appointment. Mention how we have taken some steps to ensure independence, at least for the Chief Election Commissioner. Then mention what was the 2023 law made by the government in this regard, right? Mentioning all these aspects, as simple as that. So once you incorporate this, your task is done. Okay. So yes, that's the idea with respect to the question here, and various aspects need to be analyzed on whys and hows of how this was correct or this is appropriate, this is not appropriate, uh, interference, etc. Simple. Again, nothing complicated here. Moving on to the last question, number 8, 3 subparts. 8A, firstly, the decision to conduct the population census 2027 has reopened the debate on delimitation in India, discuss its various aspects. Again, you have to talk about the concept of delimitation, concept of census. There should be some mention of this aspect, some constitutional provisions thrown in here and there, mentioning about the last delimitation also. Last exercise, mention the body, mention who are a part of the body. Okay, that's all. And then you have to talk about the political sensitivities, how states with high population growth may gain more seats, affecting the political power balance. It might feel like you are penalizing the states which have controlled populate their population, which have shown progressive or taken progressive steps to implement family planning norms in their states. It might trigger debates on the reservation for SCs, STs, OBCs, possibly in legislatures now, right? So then we have the regional and caste-based political groups, which are also keenly interested in these outcomes because they want to know exactly what is the number now that they have to target. So yes, that's also an aspect. Then will come the disputes between states. The very generic dispute will be what? The most basic dispute is going to be the potential dispute between states over seat distribution. As simple as that. Balancing population growth and political equality. Okay. And yes, delimitation impacts federalism, electoral fairness, democracy equality. So very important. You have to explain the complex constitutional amendments also, connecting census data with political representation intricacies, avoiding too much of technicalities, yet mentioning them while maintaining clarity. Okay. Then let's come to the second one. Examine how the early phase of economic planning in India laid the foundation of modern India's economic growth with reference to Nehruvian perspective. So see, the question expects you to explain what? How the planning and economic development approaches during Nehru's era contributed to post-independence India's growth trajectory. See, Nehruvian economic policies have significantly shaped India's developmental model, without doubt, of course. They have influenced state capacity, industrialization, social equity also. So, planning as a tool, that's what Nehru championed. Nehru championed a centralized planning through these 5-year plans to direct the resources optimally. Okay, so one thing is use of planning as a tool. Then the focus would be on industrialization. And then, of course, let's not forget the mixed economy model. Then also, so when I say industrialization focus, I meant to say the emphasis on heavy industries, public sector enterprises, steel, power. That's to build self-reliance. And the mixed economy model, combining state-led development with private sector role. Then agricultural attention. Yes, initiating land reforms. Then within a couple of decades, green revolution, groundwork, right, for food security. Then, of course, let's not forget, we champion in the cause of social welfare, right? Social welfare policies aimed at poverty alleviation, education, health, social justice. So that's the foundation. These laid the institutional, these laid the industrial, these laid the infrastructural basis, which were necessary for modernization. Okay. Now see, while initial growth was slow, these policies have helped in the transition of India from the colonial stagnant country, nation, or rather should we say from colonial stagnation to growth, setting the stage for later liberalization. Okay. That's it. So this is how you would explain this also. Last question from the paper. Illustrate with examples how political parties in India have played a crucial role in drawing historically disadvantaged groups into the mainstream political systems. See, when it comes to this particular idea, the idea here is to explain how Indian political parties have mainstreamed these marginalized groups, especially the scheduled caste, scheduled tribes, the other backward classes, through various strategic measures and through policies. Okay, see, social justice and inclusion are key themes in this concept, and political parties' role in bringing disadvantaged groups into the democratic participation is very crucial, right? And this question tests nothing but the basic understanding of this very electoral politics, this very caste dynamics, this very social empowerment. Okay, so you can talk about things like, of course, reservation, affirmative action. Then let's not forget party mobilization, then inclusion in the party structure also, inclusion in party structure, mass movements. See, when I say reservation and affirmative action, political parties have supported reservation policies, right? In legislature, in education, in public employment. For party mobilization, parties like Bhujan Samaj Party, they explicitly represent Dalit interests. And rise of such parties has politically empowered these groups. uh, think of inclusion, as I said, inclusion in party structure. Major national parties, say Congress, BJP, they have incorporated leaders from various groups, or rather disadvantaged groups, to widen the electoral base, empowering representation, be it the president, be it the prime minister himself, be it the vice president. These posts are used to also send a message of inclusivity. Then what else? Mass movements, let's not forget that. Mass movements, parties have mobilized backward castes through social movements, enabling their political awareness, participation. Then yes, of course, legislative representation. Yes, increased number of MPs, MLAs, of course, from these groups, that will reflect their political inclusion. BSP's rise in UP, BJP's outreach to OBCs and Dalits, Congress's historical role in framing the constitution with reservation for SCs, STs, all this has to be mentioned, including some current trends of how caste-based identity politics continues. It also intersects with development. It also intersects with governance issues. Okay, so that's it with this as well, and this brings us to an end of our discussion today. I hope you could get some idea on how to attempt these questions. So that is it for today. Oh, not today, that is it for this video. Once the second paper will be out, we'll have our discussion for the second paper as well, the IR paper for PSIR, and we'll meet in a couple of hours. Till then, that is all for me for this video. Jai Hind.